Hello, I am Ahmad Dallal, Dean of Georgetown University in Qatar, and the moderator for what we are calling the pandemic panels. 3 virtual panel discussions which gather some of our faculty experts to reflect on this global human crisis from their respective areas of expertise. We find ourselves today in a chaotic world with microscopic viral assailants, a world in which thus far, even the medical and technological advancements of the 21st century cannot ensure the collective safety of humanity. The global economy is deeply impacted, and millions, if not billions, have been pushed into poverty. The human toll of this pandemic has been enormous, with hundreds of thousands dead and millions infected, and with no clear end in sight. By most estimates, the expected loss of economic activity is in the order of trillions of dollars. Leaders have had to face some of the most difficult decisions ever made, affecting the lives of every human being. What does this mean, and what can be done, and how can the world get on a path of recovery? To address some of these pressing questions of our time, in the first panel of the 3 panels, we take a multidisciplinary look at lessons from history that could guide our way forward. In the second panel, we discuss the global response, and then in the third panel, we focus on the response in the Gulf and MENA region. Itself a form of civic engagement, we hope this forum will constructively channel the intellectual energies of the participants to better inform the general public and reflect not only on how we got here, but also where we need to go next, and most importantly, what does the road to recovery look like? In addition to these panels, Georgetown Center for International and Regional Studies, CEERS, has also launched the COVID project, a research project and data portal that traces responses to the pandemic in the GCC and Iraq, and features expert analysis of various aspects of these responses. The premise of all of these interventions is that knowledge and education are essential to recovery from the current global crisis and are the very foundation of human well-being. Factual evidence and fact-based decisions are the foundations of our human strength and resilience and welfare. So the topic of today's panel is the COVID-19 pandemic, historical and cultural perspectives, which, as the title suggests, focuses on lessons from history that can inform the global coronavirus response. The purpose of this panel is to provide historical examples of events, rulings, and laws that have bearing on today's pandemic, drawing from the Islamic legal tradition, political and legal history, and perennial ethical issues that the pandemic invokes. Joining me on today's panel are Dr. Reza Pirbhai, Professor of History and Chairperson of the faculty at Georgetown University in Qatar. His research is focused on Islam and modern South Asia. Before joining the faculty at Georgetown, he was assistant professor at the University of Manitoba in Canada and associate professor at Louisiana State University in the US. Also joining us is Dr. Amira Sumbul, professor of history with expertise in the history of modern Egypt, Islamic history, law, women, and gender in Islam. She is the author of several books in her areas of interest. She is also editor-in-chief of Hawa, the Journal of Women of the Middle East and the Islamic world. Our third panelist is Dr. Edward Kola, professor of history with expertise in European relations and the history of international law. His recent book examines the impact and effect of the French Revolution on international law, specifically tracing the emergence of popular sovereignty as a justification for claims to territory. And last but not least, Dr. Ayman Shabana, Associate Professor of Theology and Research Director of the Islamic Bioethics Project at Georgetown University in Qatar. Dr. Shabana, amongst other things, has received multiple QNRF, Qatar National Research Foundation funded projects that have produced several research outcomes specifically related to Islamic bioethics. He has written on a range of topics in the fields of Islamic ethics and bioethics, law, and history. Thank you all for joining us today and adding your specific expertise to the discussion. Let me start with the with the general question addressed to Dr. Pirbhai. The coronavirus pandemic is a historic event that is sure to be recorded. What can we learn from how global events have been recorded at the national level? And what are the ethical implications of creating nationalistic perspectives on major global events? Dr. Pirbhai.
Thank you, Dean Dallal, for this opportunity and for the very broad question, which I think might be best answered by focusing on a very specific illustrative example. In the 1890s, a global bubonic plague outbreak was dealt with in various quarters. And in my field of specialization in South Asia, the 1890s has also focused attention on health, safety, urbanization, and so on, as a result of a very significant outbreak of the bubonic plague in what's today Maharashtra state in India. It was known as the Bombay plague, and it basically was identified around 1896 and ran its course and was ultimately dealt with by 1901, 1902. At its peak, about 2,000 people a week were dying in Bombay alone. Now, what's interesting about this and why I think it's a very illustrative example is that the outbreak itself was discovered by a Goan, that is a native South Asian doctor. He brought his diagnosis to the authorities and his diagnosis was not immediately accepted. In fact, 4 groups of experts were brought into Bombay from Europe to judge whether he was right. Eventually, it was found that he was right. The British colonial authorities then set up a special plague committee that incorporated the findings of the various expert groups. And they implemented a series of measures that would actually sound quite familiar to us. There were police searches and medical examinations in people's homes. There was the isolation of the sick in hospitals, quarantine of travelers in camps, the restriction of movements of persons in urban centers, including closures of shops and so on, and also forced and voluntary evacuations of persons from not just Bombay, but a number of other cities in Maharashtra, such as Pune. By 1901, the outbreak was then brought pretty much under control, and various plans were put in place to revise the sewer and sanitation systems in various urban centers. Now, the reason I bring this up is that we can certainly recognize many of these measures in our own context. We are living in a climate of social distancing, of quarantines, of travel restrictions, and so forth. Indeed, some of these measures have even been implemented by the Indian government, just as they have the post-colonial Indian government, just as they have in various parts of the world. As well, then, in the 1890s as now, the population largely cooperated with government initiatives. Then as now as well, government forces very often resorted to coercive means, including open violence against those who did not comply with government directives. But what's interesting here, and what brings me to your question, particularly regarding nationalistic narrations of such events, is that in the response that we see as part of the national narrative of India today, it's not the efficacy or lack thereof of the government response that's in any way examined. In fact, most of the kinds of facts that I've brought you, of the kind of complexities of the outbreak, are not discussed at all. Instead, the Goan native doctor is identified as a great hero for having identified the plague. And 3 brothers who I haven't mentioned, who were tried for murder and executed, having assassinated the British head of the Special Plague Commission are not only exalted as heroes of the national movement, but have major memorials set up to them in their native city of Pune. There's an award-winning Marathi film about them, and as recently as 2018, their portraits also appeared on stamps issued by the Indian government. So I guess the point is, and what I learned from this, is that nationalistic perspectives on major global events are determined by politics. They're determined by the political climate of the day. The national movement in the colonial period criticized the British government for the manner in which it handled the outbreak. And at the same time, the national government of today is following very much the same measures and acting in very much the same way as well. So when we put it in that way, a nationalistic narrative is really a stilted narrative that's driven by political and ideological considerations. And tying it to ethics, well, I mean, all I can really say is that I don't believe ethics has much of a role to play when we're talking about political and ideological narratives. It's rather fitting the political needs and power structures of the day that we're actually looking at. So there you have.
Let's hope you're not completely right on this last one, but we can only hope. Thank you. Dr. Symbol, you plan to teach a summer course at Georgetown University in Qatar called Chronicling Corona, teaching students about some of the ethical positions historians take and the challenges of creating meaningful histories. How much does it matter who records the history, and how can we ensure that there are a diversity of voices in this process?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I have a number of historians here, so I think we will all agree that the first problem we face is the sources we're going to use for the course, and basically how we are going to present the material to the students. In this particular course, because of the combination of the historical narrative here and also what's happening today, I have structured it to actually be always aware of what the sources are and to also introduce the sources to the students. I also divided the subjects that we are going to cover into health, since health has been a very important vehicle. I actually wrote a book about this, by which you can actually examine and understand the historical process, and that health has also been a subject of great importance to humanity since the beginning of time. And then the second would be the epidemics, to introduce them to the history of epidemics. Actually, today I just finished a marathon 2-hour lecture on the history of epidemics from caveman till today. And I must tell you, it's pretty daunting and exhausting, you know, but I tried. The thing is, I'm hoping that for the rest of the semester, then we can just focus on some of them as we go along. But this way they can have a big view. And I must tell you, because of my belief in primary sources, I insisted on using only primary sources for that, for this general introduction, just to let students know that primary sources are available in history to be used. The third subject, of course, is going to be Corona 2020, because this is what we are doing here. And then chronicling. How are we going to chronicle this? And this is here where the whole idea of voices becomes very important. I tell my students that what we're chronicling today is going to be the primary source in 100 years. So we have to do it with great consciousness and with awareness of what we're doing. We need to cover exactly how we actually feel and how we are dealing with the situation we found ourselves, how we are reacting. We are, after all, Georgetown, and this is a school of foreign service. They're going to take us seriously. Whoever is reading here is going to look at us in a different way than perhaps just a normal diary, although I do want the normal diary. And basically, we need to see how are we looking into the debates, the bigger debates taking place today, the politics that are going on, the clashes between governments, the whole question of the different conspiracy theories. We want to see these, the impact of this, the idea of world trade and the clash in world trade, for example, today between China and America, and where that comes in, the role of governments and the role of elections and other diversity is a very diverse, very big question that also has a great deal of precedents historically that we are always using to bring into the outlook here. Most importantly, I make it very clear that when you are presenting an idea, you are inframing an idea and must be aware of the seriousness of this. By inframing it, you're also giving your own point of view, just like taking a picture. And the picture only represents what you're seeing, but not the larger picture. So diversity is very important. We, for example, have students in the dorm, and already the image coming from the dorm is a totally different experience in Doha than the rest of us who are not in a dorm. We have a student in Washington, D.C. at present. So that also is opening up this diversity is coming in, and in a way, this is the almost like the Georgetown type of experiential course, where we're not just studying the history, we're not just studying the politics, but also experiencing it in our own hand. And I'm hoping to teach them good writing. And what chronicling good writing is, we brought in a bunch of readings about epidemics, for example, diversity, Camus' The Plague, which I think everybody should be reading, on Oran. It's a beautiful novel, and I think it's very apropos, a town that suddenly finds themselves facing a plague and don't know what the hell to do. So we're using this. We're also using parts of Jabarti that deal with the plague hitting Egypt, which happened so very, very often. We're using actually parts of Al-Jahiz to talk about the Farra, the plague that came to birds, and really how the Islamic community during the Prophet's time dealt with it. We're dealing with the Plague of London from Daniel Defoe, which he wrote, but interestingly enough, he didn't just write it himself. He was taking the stories of friends and relatives and uncles and putting them together in what one can say is a little bit of narrative. So it's semi-literature, semi-reality, because he's experienced it himself. But I also thought to give them a bit of humor. So I think that probably Eddie is very familiar with von Grummelshausen's, The Adventures of a Simpleton, about the 30 Years' War in Germany, which is just a fantastic book that talks about one of the worst wars and most fatalistic wars of all time, which also had the plague at the same time. And he, of course, is telling his own story. He was the simpleton. Wonderful story that actually shows you can chronicle and do it with humorously. So yeah, I agree with you. I think there's a good question you ask. How to approach this is not something you can just say this is easy. Actually, it took more time to decide what and how to approach the subject than any other probably subject I've had before. Before we close, I just wanted to tell you, one of the things I asked the students to chronicle is not just day-to-day events, but also the problems with shopping, the problems with how they're facing with their schoolwork, their fears and worries about the future and what it is that comes to them, and at the same time also to collect memes. I've begun to collect memes about the corona, and basically I think these memes are going to be very funny for people in the future. These collections of them, they're fascinating when you start looking for them on the humor and so on. People are trying to deal with things. There's the tragic, and there is the and then there are the rest of us who have pets and what we are doing with pets. It seems we have quite a number who have pets and they really are worried about pets. So yeah, diversity, absolutely. And I'm hoping that by the end of the semester, what we'll have is a very rich sort of record of diverse approaches to this subject.
Dr. Symbol, if I may, thank you for this overview. If I may follow up with a brief question. What have you learned from your own study of the historical record about women that might inform, in the context of this historical moment of the pandemic, the perspectives through which we view history and act in it?
Oh, okay. Well, from my research, I can say without any doubt that women practitioners have been central to the war against epidemics and other diseases all the way back from the beginning of time. We actually see them already on cave art. I actually showed the students some cave art today. You can actually see them there. You can see them throughout history. They appear as kahinat, you know. They appear as guild masters for health guilds. They appear as doctresses on donkeys, as in the case of Muhammad Ali's Egypt, where he created a school of medicine for women and sent out the women and gave them donkeys to go and inoculate, by the way, because Egypt had early inoculations from the smallpox appearing all the way in the early 19th century. And inoculation against smallpox actually began at the end of the 18th century. And so we see them going out to inoculate as women. So women have been central. And this is not recognized today, you know, has been central from the very beginning as being part of. I always say that in the pre-modern period, gynecology and obstetrics were actually both the profession for women, particularly in the Middle East, but also in Europe for midwives and so on. But in the Middle East, simply because of Islam, the prohibition that men touch the bodies of foreign women. So you may have a male doctor, may always have, the practitioner would be actually a, woman, a male midwife. We also see from the historical record that women during plagues suffered a lot. There was a great deal of suffering from women, and basically fatalities amongst women was extremely high, perhaps because they were mostly living in smaller areas. You know, they didn't have the ability to get away, like rat infestations and the rest of it. So it was a very high. One thing that we've learned today from reading, from looking at domestic violence, which is now beginning to show from incarceration. And by the way, you know, social distancing is nothing new. They've known social distancing all the way back when, in fact, there's a very famous story of Caliph Umar writing to Abu Ubaid al-Jarrah, who was up in Palestine at the time, and told him, come home because there's a plague. And he told him, I cannot leave. This is the ethics. I cannot leave. We don't leave once the plague happens. That's social distancing. Once you had the plague somewhere, you never left and nobody came in. And he actually died from the plague. So we've known that social distancing has always been practiced, which is an interesting thing to look at. But we have not studied domestic abuse enough for the past. So today, the domestic abuse we are seeing is now making me reflect back. I do have a lot of cases brought to court for domestic abuse, but never this seriously. And I think that this is something for us to open the research about actually the nature of domestic violence that pre-existed, and particularly, you know, during the times of rape. One last thing, we are using one particular diary written by a nurse. Her name is Alice Braun, and she was a nurse during the Boer Wars in South Africa, where also they had numerous diseases and needed women. And her diary is extremely well written and very good. So we do have also very good diaries written by women that we want to show them chronicling. One of the things I tried to do is to put wars and plagues together, and not that these calamities, not always that they came together, but they actually helped each other. Yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Oh, you did. Thank you so much. Now, let us look a little more at the historical record and lessons from some major events. Dr. Kola, your work deals with the French Revolution and subsequent foreign policy, operating both within the consent of the people, with the consent of the people, as well as invoking the notion of strategic exigency, or the government making decisions against what the people want when facing foreign threat, for example. How can this example serve as a cautionary tale for the rights of people when a nation is facing an external threat, in this case, the pandemic? What rules are under threat, and how is nationalism used to further the government's aims?
Thank you. That's a great question, because I think this has been an extremely delicate balance since at least the time of the revolution, and ever since, when you need to balance, on the one hand, the rights of people and what authorities might think is best for people, whatever best might mean, versus, whatever threat is existing, an existential threat, a threat from a foreign enemy, for example, or, as you say, a current virus. Funnily enough, I think one of the best quotes on this subject comes from Maximilien Robespierre, in a quote when he is defending the terror during the height of the French Revolution. Now, I don't mean to be defending the terror, but he gets this delicate balance, I think, very well when he says, and I'm quoting here, "It is necessary to extinguish the internal and external enemies of the Republic, or to perish with the Republic. It is in this situation that the first maxim of politics must be to treat the people with reason and to treat enemies with terror. Because without virtue, terror is deadly. But without terror, virtue is powerless." So this shows that, there's this really difficult decision that needs to sometimes be made. We got to make these tough calls, or else, the state's going to fall apart. But one big problem with this, and this has been identified by a number of people through history, is that, states, or especially authoritarian leaders, can sometimes take advantage of these situations. I'm not going to go so far or be as cynical quite as Naomi Klein, when she, in her book, The Shock Doctrine, from about a decade ago, talks about the way governments or powerful groups take advantage of situations or disasters to try and advance controversial or, again, authoritarian policies when people are distracted or afraid. But there are examples of this, right, that should give us pause. Aside from the pandemic, which I'll come back to in a second, a perfect example is 9/11, right? All the security infrastructure, all the surveillance that was built up at that time to protect people against terrorism is really, I think, in my opinion at least, really falling too far on one side of the balance. Now, with respect to COVID, I think there are genuinely legitimate concerns that even with the best intentions, many states can institute new restrictions about movement, about surveillance that could simply go on to become the new normal. I mean, apps that track your movement that people are using to track, people who have had contact with the virus, or who might even be in quarantine with the virus, is one concern, that those sorts of tracking mechanisms will just stick around, or that, even greater harvesting of our biodata will just continue going forward. But there are even more frightening examples of states like Viktor Orban's Hungary, or even the People's Republic of China, which is already a police state, using the crisis to clamp down further on critics or on dissent, to surveil their population more closely, or even to, in the case of Orban, establish seemingly indefinite emergency powers to deal with the crisis. And there are lots of examples in history of these sorts of emergency powers invoked in crisis that then lead to really awful consequences. Now, that all said, I don't want to come across as some sort of conspiracy theorist, right? I actually had to write or respond to an email to my whole family in a chain with a video sent by a distant relation of mine that claimed the COVID whole epidemic was a plot between both billionaire bankers and Marxist revolutionaries. And if you know much about history, you know that those two groups don't often really work well together, to create some sort of global government. Now, I personally trust the expertise of epidemiologists and the World Trade Organization, or not the World Trade Organization, sorry, the World Health Organization. And so again, the need to find the balance between listening to what these experts say, because it's in our best interests, versus not letting this slip too far, that too much control gets taken to authorities. It's like I said, history shows this is an extremely difficult balance that goes back to the time of Robespierre.
Thank you. Let me expand on the idea of historical engagement with ethical dilemmas and looking to the historical records for guidance during this crisis. Dr. Shabana, you've compiled a broad Islamic bioethics compendium. In doing this research, what historical events led to Islamic rulings and actions pertinent to today's pandemic? And what were some of these rulings? And if you could elaborate a little more also on some of the perennial ethical questions around medical ethics that are being re-engaged with responses to COVID-19, such as the right to medical care, impact on the elderly, allocation of scarce medical resources, and end-of-life issues, to name just a few.
Thank you very much, Dean Dallal, for inviting me to this distinguished panel. I'm really honored, and I was really intrigued by what my colleagues said earlier about these various narratives in different settings and contexts, and how people kind of responded and interacted. But what interested me most is the role of ethics, of course, given my expertise on ethics and whether ethics matter, and if yes, to what extent. And let me, if you allow me, begin with this account that is included in Ibn Battuta's famous travels, which I use in my course in Islamic world. And here Ibn Battuta appears in Damascus at the time of the plague that took place in the year Common Era 1348, corresponding to 749 Hijrah or Islamic calendar. And he talks about this mosque as opposed to the Jama'. So this is not the Jum'ah mosque, it's not the biggest mosque, but for some reason it held some sort of a symbolic significance and importance for the community, to the extent that they would go to this mosque in order to offer special prayers, that God would lift, the plague, the pandemic. It was called the Mosque of Al-Aqdam, or the feet. There were some stories linking this mosque with Prophet Musa for some reason. But the point here is that during the time of the plague, which was pretty severe at that time, according to Ibn Battuta as well, the number of casualties in Damascus reached up to 1,000 per day. And it was also interesting that he compared what was happening in Egypt at that time, and he said that in Egypt was much more severe, to the extent that the number of casualties reached up to, I'm quoting him, 24,000 casualties per day. So you can imagine the magnitude of that event. So the point here is that people would gather in this mosque, offer special prayer, and that included the masses, but also the leaders, the army kind of chiefs and commanders, etc. And after offering these prayers, they would go out barefooted and basically engaged in this collective supplication to God that He would lift that plague. And this then intrigues me to ask the question about the role of ethics and what we mean by ethics. So I think this is a very important question, because here I think the religious dimension kind of informed what people meant by ethics, which informed and inspired, how they lived their daily lives. But in general, in the Islamic tradition, as my colleagues know quite well, in the Islamic tradition, there is a significant body of literature that addresses the issue of pandemics and plagues, given the occurrence of these series or sequences of plagues over time. This literature is actually quite diverse. So it includes reflections by theologians, religious scholars, historians, travelers, and also physicians. So people like Razi and people like Ibn Sina, for example. And each of these groups discussed plagues and pandemics from their respective perspectives. So for theologians and religious scholars, they concentrated on, the ideal attitude of a believer, how he or she should conduct himself or herself in response to that. When it comes to travelers and historians, they concentrate on documenting actual incidents of plagues in different places at different times. When it comes to physicians, they concentrated on technical issues like diagnosis, prognosis, and also treatment. So to come back to your question about historical roots and foundation, I think we can refer to two main types. We have, on the one hand, scriptural sources, going all the way back to the foundational sources of Islam, the Quran, and I see the background of Professor Sumbul's, this beautiful kind of illustration of the pandemics. This comes essentially from the scripture, right? So here we learned that pandemic or a plague was sent as a form of punishment for, you know, the people of the book. And also that includes various prophetic reports talking about plagues and in terms of their causation and also in terms of proper response, you know, to these incidents of plague. The second type is actual incidents of plagues or pandemics that triggered commentary from Muslim scholars and thinkers. So this body of literature, if we ask about relationship to the current kind of situation, I think this literature is quite relevant because in essence, it deals with the human condition as it faces existential threats. So it relates to questions of life and death, and therefore has connections to the Islamic system of belief, the practice, and also morality. From the perspective of belief, the primary issue is theodicy and the effort to reconcile belief in a benevolent God and the occurrence of evil, if we think of disease or if disease is conceptualized as a form of evil. There is, of course, other relevant questions like the question of Qadar or destiny in connection with the issue of contagion, and among others. From the perspective of practice, it affects almost all ritual practices, such as prayer, specifically collective congregational prayers and the extent to which they can still be held under these kinds of circumstances or whether they should be suspended. The issue of fasting, to some extent, some people were raising questions related to that as well, and definitely the question of pilgrimage, Hajj and Umrah, and whether they can still be performed under these conditions. It also affects the area of transactions, particularly questions related to wills, testament, and inheritance, given, you know, the number of people who die and they leave behind, you know, their wealth, their properties, and of course that raises questions of what to be done, you know, with these. There is also a range of other rulings pertaining to the human body, both during life, but also following death. Question of proper washing and burial, etc. There is, beyond all these legalistic issues, a range of other moral and ethical issues that pertain to the various types of social interactions. So as we can see, these issues operate both at the internal and individual levels, but also at the external and social levels. If I may get into the second question about the type of responses or questions that you raised, I think, just to be brief here, I think we can think or identify of three sets of questions that correspond or match three main stages when we think about the current crisis or current COVID-19 situation. First, we have the precautionary measures that aim to prevent the occurrence of disease itself. And here we have to think about possible adverse effects, especially on disadvantaged groups. Earlier we heard from my colleague Edward Kola about, you know, the role of the state in imposing some strict and stringent kind of rules and regulations. To what extent these rules and regulations would result also in some adverse effects. And even the issue of quarantine, when you ask people to stay at home, for example, if these people don't have, you know, steady sources of income, you know, how are these people going to survive? We have also to think about that. I think there are ethical issues there. The second set of questions, they have to do with proper care for those who are already affected. So here we have to talk about right to adequate medical care, allocation of scarce medical resources, setting priorities, who gets the treatment before who, if any, impact on the elderly, definitely. And also, among other things, and we hear a lot these days about psychological impact on the medical staff. And another very important point is access to vaccine. If and once they become available, I mean, that would open also a host of other ethical questions about access. Who will get access to these vaccines first, and on what basis? The third group or set of questions, they have to do with treatment or handling of dead bodies. Sorry. Yes, so here we have to talk about, you know, how these bodies should be treated, handled with care, with dignity, according to Islamic rules and regulations. So in general, we notice, I mean, based on the survey of the scholarly, even in the current moment, we see that deliberations on all these questions, ethical questions, that is, almost always boil down to balancing or reconciling individual benefits or interests with or against wider social needs or considerations. Now, from an Islamic perspective, what we often hear from scholars and experts is that while thinking about these questions, considerations of the public good should not trump supreme ethical values, especially those grounded in definitive scriptural sources.
Thank you, Dr. Shabana. You raise many questions. Maybe later I can ask you for some answers, some brief answers to some of these questions. Dr. Sumbul, you have also studied medical history. What is the connection between medical care regimes and governance systems and political regimes? And to what extent did governance systems shape the response to pandemics? And conversely, to what extent did pandemics precipitate political instability and change?
How long do we have? I'll try to make it as short
as about 15 minutes. We will talk until we.
I'll make it. It's short and to the point. I just wanted to react to something that Ayman says that also deals with this, which is very important, and that's the question of poverty and class. And this is something that differs according to governments as well, and that is governments that have large majorities of poor people and people who live in confined areas and in closer proximity are bound to see a greater a spread of these diseases and a greater difficulty of control. Even the idea of the burial, we've seen cases where the government has had to send in military forces to actually enforce the burial of people with. So the questions that the Professor Shabanis sets out are extremely important, and they have, and I don't think other governments realize that certain governments have to face this a great deal. We see a big shift in governmentality and health with the modern period. Before that, and I must say that states have always been interested to health. We can see actually states and laws and controls all the way back to the Mesopotamia and Hammurabi and the rest. We certainly see it on papyri in the case of Egypt. We see papyri, voluminous papyri left about the health measures that were set up, whether we're talking about ancient Egypt or the Greco-Roman period. But it's really only in the modern period that we find that the state is directly involved in health and takes it upon itself to be to be responsible for health in one way or the other. Again, this differs according to the system of the regime of power system that we have in place. If you take governments that with centralized states, like the case of Russia, of course, after communist Russia, and almost today they're liberalizing, but they still have a basic structure where a great deal of services, etc., are still more or less the responsibility of the state, or countries like Egypt, about which I wrote my book. And in this case, we see the state actually confiscating the waqfs that were the source of income for the various hospitals that existed from the Islamic age. And the state since then had become actually the creator of universities or schools of medicine, the production of the medical profession, and also somehow of providing medical services. So the strength of the state also means the strength of the medical facilities and vice versa. Having said that, because most of the states are still not exactly the strongest, we find that folk medicine and medical ways of old ways of dealing with this kind of diseases have also continued as a side medicine. It's always been, the two have always been there side to side, and maybe that's one of the reasons why in many countries, perhaps Reza can talk about Pakistan here, many countries where you have large communities, agricultural communities, you're going to see that they're very dependent on also local practitioners or local types of health, and not just only with the centralized state. I should add one last thing, that with the centralized state, what we have is the introduction, at least in the case of Egypt, since the time and actually before Muhammad Ali Pasha, or this is the end of the 18th century that we actually see the very first inoculations being introduced. But we've always had a consistent effort to vaccine, maybe because Egypt's part of Africa, and this is where a lot of the epidemics have arrived. But I promise you, I have had every kind of vaccine you can imagine, whether it's smallpox or you name it, cholera, malaria. We just have, and maybe that has helped. We don't know yet. This is something that's being looked into, but the reality is that the general population believes it. And they also believe that they have some form of a herb immunity already. Where does it come from, or how it shows you that perhaps a lack of understanding about this corona that exists today. But let's move to the other side of the world. In a country like the United States today, the biggest debate, of course, is, and here we have like a federal government. We have states, and we have a centralized government, and the big debate going on is who's responsible. Was until now, whenever Trump is caught on when you were late doing this, he says it's the governors, and the governments say it is the states. So we have an ongoing debate there that actually shows the great link between the two, and that is the system of governmentalities and the politics and expectations of the people and what happens with the health services. As for the political instability, I actually thought of two particular examples that will explain how important and how devastating plagues can be, and how they weaken states, and the fact that a lot of states today have decided to open up or to go back, even though it is so drastic. Perhaps comes from the historical lessons. And this really comes from Greco-Roman times. The first is the Athens epidemic of 430. This was during the Peloponnesian Wars, when Athens was actually beating Sparta, but Athens got hit by a plague, which later was talked about as being a typhus. That this was a typhus plague, that it was the culprit that hit Athens, and actually they lost the war. They lost the war because they lost almost half their population. It was horrible, and that plague actually started in Ethiopia, went all the way up to Egypt, into Libya, and then crossed into Greece, and then into the rest of Europe. It was one of the very earliest cases where they saw this kind of pandemic taking place. The other one is a better known one, and that is known as the Justinian plague of 541. And that one is a very, very, very a good example, because that plague spread it's said, and this is a real plague, it's the first bubonic plague, and it's supposed to have come all the way from China but nobody really knows the origins of that plague. It's supposed to have come through the trade routes, and then spreading to the west, crossing into the Roman Empire. Rome, of course, had expanded all over Europe, had expanded into North Africa, into the Levant, and so we find the plague everywhere there. Actually, the Roman armies contracted it in Mesopotamia, and from there they took it up with them. I guess they didn't have herb or heard. They were new to the Black Plague when it hit them, and they took it with them, and it was actually quite devastating. It ended up by killing 30 to 100 million over the next 2 or 3 generations. Now look at the result of this. The result is that it weakened 2 huge empires that dominated the ancient world, and that's the Sasanian Empire and the Roman Empire. And by the time the Arabs were ready for the great expanses about 640 when they began, these 2 empires had become very weakened, and part of the big reason for their weakening was actually the Justinian plague, which had decimated and really, really weakened the armies and the abilities of this empire to withstand a new, fresh invasion. So we see 2 huge empires actually being destroyed and succumbing and being taken over by a brand new empire, which spread so fast and over the areas that actually had originally been part of this empire for many reasons, but that was definitely one of the important reasons. So I hope this example answers your question.
Thank you so much. Dr. Kola, could you give us some insights from the history of European responses and consequences during pandemics, such as the Black Death or maybe the Spanish flu?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of the responses aren't really applicable now because, of course, we have germ theory and they didn't back then. But, as many of my colleagues have already said, in a lot of plagues in the past, quarantine was known to be something of an efficient means to try and limit spread. One really relevant similarity, I think, between, what went on during the Black Death, what's going on now, and what's probably existed in almost every instance of, pandemic in the past is that, people get scared. And that fear, when it becomes so widespread, causes people to question fundamentals about their society or their ethics. At the time of the Black Death, they genuinely asked, is this a plague sent from God because he's unhappy with us? And if so, why? And if so, what can we do about it? And as a result, often traditional forms of authority get challenged, in part because they hadn't predicted or prevented these calamities. I mean, we see that obviously going on today too. I don't want to put too much of a silver lining on it, but one thing we do see in the aftermath of especially really awful pandemics is there is something of a significant bounce back. And that bounce back has been quite significant historically. The demographic and economic boom and then the cultural flourishing that came after the Black Death has in some measures been attributed as contributory to the Renaissance in northern Italy. Amira talked before about the 30 Years' War. Obviously, the huge cataclysm of the 30 Years' War was fundamental for the creation of modern natural rights theory and social contract theory, which underpins, a lot of government in the world today. And even in the aftermath of the Spanish flu, and obviously the huge destruction of World War I that went before it, for all of the economic and political instability in Europe, and especially in Weimar Germany at that time, we see great artistic and cultural flourishing to a degree. And so, I certainly hope that the COVID pandemic doesn't cause so much disruption to society that we're going to see a regeneration on those sorts of same historical levels. But that would seriously require, things to get much, much worse than they have so far. And I, like I said, hope sincerely that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
We all hope so. There are clearly parallels to today's situation in history, but there are significant differences. But I think also there are historical warnings, if we can call it this. To look at a different example, Dr. Pirbhai, what are some of the key recent historical events in South Asia that impact the region's pandemic response today? And how has the historical narrative in the region played a role in the response?
I think many of the responses of my co-panelists actually feed into the response I would give to this question. In terms of South Asia specifically, rather than speak of an event, I would speak of a phenomenon. And that phenomenon is tied to nationalism. It's tied to the questions of religious ethics. It's tied to the broader and longer history of states and the manner in which they have and have not dealt with various types of calamities and natural catastrophes and so on, including pandemics. If we put all of this together, the phenomenon in South Asia that I think really is representative of where that region stands today, politically, economically, culturally, in various ways, and that is most informative or most influential when speaking of pandemic responses is actually religious nationalism. Ideologies that seek to answer the kinds of, or claim to in some respects, answer the kinds of ethical questions that Dr. Shabana has mentioned and translate them into top-heavy statist directives that Dr. Sunbal has mentioned, and then tie and justify them all together through various types of ideological means that Dr. Kohler mentioned in a Western context. Here we have them being basically articulated as a religious nationalist kind of perspective. So how does this play into the responses that we see? Well, very recently, the BJP government, the Hindu nationalist government of India, issued a directive saying that if you go and drink water from the Ganges, this will help cure you and protect you from COVID. The scientific authorities, including the branches of government that are involved in COVID responses in India, were obviously extremely alarmed that the elected government of the state was saying the solution to your problems is to drink from the Ganges. That's one example of the way in which this larger phenomenon, rather than an event of religious nationalism, is really shaping much of the discourse that's taking place in South Asia. Another example would be that in non-Muslim majority states, in Sri Lanka, for example, which is majority Buddhist, and India, which is majority Hindu, minorities have been largely scapegoated for the spreading of the virus, even for the origination of the virus in certain respects. And this has led to responses such as, for example, in Sri Lanka, the order that Muslim dead must be cremated, something that Dr. Shabana was talking about as well in terms of how you deal with the dead. So here we again find a state, a modern state, and as has already been noted, modern states exercise power in a very different way, and pre-modern states have in a much more heavy-handed way. They have the capacity, a much greater capacity. And so we see policies that move beyond the scientific calls from the WHO to quarantine and so on being reflected in more politically charged manners, and that have a reflection basically of the kinds of rivalries and power centers that exist in various states, relationships between majorities and minorities as well. In Pakistan, another very interesting phenomenon, which is not restricted to Pakistan, but which we could see in different respects in different parts of the world, is the great debate over the closure or opening of mosques. Various Jamaats in Pakistan of great influence and power have refused government directives to close mosques to congregational prayers, and particularly in Ramadan, for all of the various types of events and functions that take place at mosques throughout the month. This is, again, coming in the face of international WHO directives that have been ultimately adopted at the state level in Pakistan. But the state has had to ultimately respond by allowing for these parties to ultimately have a say and allow for people to continue to congregate in mosques. And another very interesting facet of this, again, how deeply entrenched this religious nationalist kind of, the link between politics and religion in South Asia is represented in the COVID response, is the fact that within the Pakistani state itself, not only has the state had to bow to the Jamaats, the religious parties' directives, but we found various people as well who've challenged more mundane kinds of directives to stay in your neighborhoods, stay at home, and so on. Also, then on the basis of the fact that, well, if we can go pray, why can't we go to the shops? So there's a knock-on effect in this sense as well when it comes to the way in which these issues are unfolding. And I would say another interesting aspect of this too is the manner in which, and this is pertinent to your first question as well, Dean Dallal, the manner in which nationalism and national narratives are shaping the responses. For example, Pakistan's ideology is one of pan-Islamism in various ways. And so in trying to bring local religious authorities under the directives of the government, the Pakistan government reached out to Saudi authorities, the ulama in Mecca and Medina. They also reached out to Al-Azhar, and they procured fatwas from Al-Azhar and from the Haram cities, ulama, basically saying it's perfectly legitimate to close mosques during this time, to limit congregational prayer and so on. And those fatwas did not stand. Instead, the fatwas of national ulama stood and have influenced the government. So we see so many different complexities ultimately in the South Asian context that draw together, in my opinion, many of the issues that we're talking about here. Islamic and more generally religious bioethics, the manner in which states have over time become much more powerful and their capacity to, in the modern period, enforce measures, have challenged their own directives in terms of the rights of privacy and assembly and so on. And at the same time as well, particularities that deal with, that are reflexive of South Asian history over the last century, from the manner in which people responded to the colonial state to the way in which they have formed their post-colonial states. It's very hard to untie all of the different facets of the discussion that we are each in our own way contributing to here.
Thank you so much. We're running out of time, but if you indulge me, if you're willing, maybe I could ask a couple of additional questions. I think, and if I could ask for very quick answers and maybe conclude with the final question for the whole panel. The first question, and if you could give us a brief response, Dr. Shabana, to what extent is the notion of a contagion warranted in the Islamic tradition, in the Islamic historical tradition, and how can it be understood in light of conflicting scriptural references? And also by extension, the larger question is there a proper response by a believer from the perspective of the Islamic normative tradition? I know this is a big question, but if you could give us a succinct, short answer to this question,
sure,
or just begin to give us an answer.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, the topic of contagion is extremely interesting, and historically it has provoked a very extended and extensive debate. Sometimes actually involving both the jurists and the physicians. Sometimes, pitting them against each others, and sometimes in the scholarly literature, the opinions of these two groups are presented as somehow dichotomous. But I think nuanced research would show that the issue is more complex and more multifaceted, if you will. But I think the main concern here that the issue of contagion raises is the potential tension or conflict with divine will or divine destiny, if you will. In other words, if God destined certain diseases to occur at a particular time in a particular place, whether human action would bar that, would prevent that, right, through contagion or through other means. So as you can see, it raises deeper theological actually issues, and with that also it raises the various disagreements among the various theological orientations and trends. But I think the roots of this kind of debate can be traced all the way to some scriptural sources, as you indicated, particularly prophetic reports. In some reports, for example, we see that these reports deny the effect or the influence of contagion, or seem to do so, while others seem to suggest that contagion actually works and actually is influential. And throughout history, scholars have tried to reconcile these two sets of reports. So, for example, some scholars try to suggest that reports that negate the impact of contagion tend to list contagion along with a host of other items or phenomena that belong to pre-Islamic Arabian culture, phenomena that would be categorized as superstitions, basically. So in that sense, contagion is linked to these pre-Islamic Arabian superstitions, and the reports that deny these superstitions tend to deny contagion as part of that pre-Islamic Arabian culture, right? And this is even confirmed further by some reports that seem to both establish and negate contagion at the same time. So we see, for example, very interestingly, one hadith opens by negating contagion, but ending with the admonition to stay away from those who are affected or impacted by a contagious disease. You know, la adwa, la safar, and then the conclusion is وَفِرَّ مِنَ الْمَجْذُومِ فِرَارَكَ مِنَ الْأَسَدِ, and flee from the leper as you would flee from the lion. Now, another way the scholars suggested to reconcile these seemingly conflicting reports is that contagion does not work by itself as a kind of an independent and a necessary kind of factor, but somehow it is linked to God's permission and to divine will. In other words, divine providence uses or instrumentalizes contagion as a cause to disease. So it works with rather than against or despite divine will. So this issue is also connected with a larger issue of causality, as you can see, and how causality is explained. And I'm sure my colleagues here know about this debate on causality and the various theological schools about it. In the modern period, the debate is still relevant, and some scholars basically try to attribute commentaries in the pre-modern period, commentaries that try to support the contagion negating reports, basically to the available medical knowledge at that time, to the extent that almost everyone, you know, within the religious kind of realm, no one kind of dares negate the impact or the influence of contagion as a matter of principle, but basically everyone almost is careful basically to clarify that relationship between contagion and divine will. Finally, I think you mentioned the issue of quarantine, and I think Professor Sumbul also referred to it briefly when she was talking about that earlier narrative involving Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah and the trip that Umar ibn Khattab, the second caliph, made to Damascus, and on the way he heard about the plague that impacted Damascus, and then he consulted his companions whether he should proceed to Damascus, whether he should go back with the Muslim army, you know, with the intention or with the aim or the goal of protecting and saving their lives, go back to Medina. And after consulting with them, people disagreed, and eventually he made the decision to go back. And it was at that time when Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah himself, the leader of the army, at that time asked the second caliph, Umar ibn Khattab, whether he would be fleeing from God's destiny. And at that time, Umar Khattab gave the famous statement saying that, yes, I would be fleeing from God's destiny to God's destiny. And of course, the statement is still quite relevant and invoked quite often by people in these kinds of discussion. There is more to it, but I understand that we are running out.
We are. Dr. Kollab, to talk also, if possible, briefly before we conclude, talk about another normative legal tradition. You've written about historical international law governing trade. The question that I would like to ask is, if there is a brief answer to that question, how can international agreements help stop the spread of infection or bind countries into actions that aid in its spread? And on the other side, what are the unintended consequences of international law? And how can current law be used to create a more equitable global response to the pandemic?
No, that's another great question. I mean, I don't have the epidemiological expertise to talk about whether international law or particular international agreements, closing borders, for example, can do much to spread the disease. But I think it does show a couple of things that are quite trenchant in terms of actually criticisms of international law in the world today. I mean, we saw almost overnight the lovely globalized order that we lived in basically shut down. I mean, countries threw up borders, planes stopped flying, there were, spats between states to try and get medical equipment. And so the rules-based international order that we like to think emerged after the Second World War in terms of a system with international organizations, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, all really started to show a big weakness, because this is something that's been identified by I think one of the best international law theorists in the world today, a guy named Mario Cascanini, and he talks about a really important disconnect between what he calls the global governance ethos and international law. And what that would mean in this situation is the World Health Organization saying, okay, let's do this, and that, and other things to contain the virus. Well, what if those measures are illegal? What if it would take 10 years for all countries to come together and negotiate an international convention on how to deal with the pandemic? So these measures really show, or that reality shows, that the role of international law in trying to fix this crisis might not actually be very important. And as a result, we see what legal scholars call the fragmentation of international law. So individual states or groups of states starting to go themselves. Australia and New Zealand have decided to essentially close their borders to all other countries and only allow travel and trade between the two until a vaccine comes along. And so I think, what we're possibly going to see going forward is much more of that fragmentation of international law. And again, indeed, the sort of limits of international law to deal with something of this magnitude.
Thank you so much. This is a very rich conversation. Thank you all for your input. I mean, we could go on much longer, but we have to conclude. If I may ask a very general question to all of you, if you care to give some final comments. The current pandemic is a natural disaster. What kinds of ideas and perspectives does history bring to having to deal with events and actions outside of human history and human control? And what can we learn to help us understand and cope with the current crisis? If you care to give your final short, brief comments, please. Amira, would you like to start?
Very fast. I think that one of the things that history teaches us is that we have actually been the culprits here and not the animals from whom we get the pandemics. Simply because we've moved into their territory, we've pushed them together, we've taken away their habitats. And I think that the message that the world should listen to today is to see the answers in going back and finding out what it is that has really happened, and rather than fighting politically and fighting for economics and the rest of it, really begin to look at the what is good and what is healthy. As long as the environment worked, as long as man kept away from the space of animals or abusing them. Moving in, for example, you move into bats, and bats no longer have their habitat, and they begin to move where they can find food, so they move in with other animals, and that way they begin to pass the diseases they have to a pet or to another animal that then brings it to man. So what we see is really an abuse of the environment, and this has happened systematically, increasingly, with the growth of trade, with the growth of communication, with the growth of the cutting down of trees of the world, and so on. There is a big problem with what we have done to the environment that really needs to be looked at. An environment, perhaps, we have two choices. Either we want Brave New World, where we're all going to live in little cells like this, and now we're getting a taste of it, or we have better clean our act and make the world we live in a place that would respect the creatures we live and whose now we know our life is completely interlaced and almost rhizomatic with even the smallest of God's creatures.
Thank you so much. Dr. Pirbhai?
I would briefly say that as a historian, listening to my colleagues, knowing some of these examples of plague and pestilence in the past, in a way it's kind of comforting because, and I hate to be the one who's the optimist here and throwing in a happy note, but what it's taught me is that epidemics, pandemics, plague is a part of history from the beginning of time, and it will continue to be as we go forward. But humanity, in one way or the other, has actually managed to deal with it in every instance and has managed to construct institutions, legal regimes, pose ethical questions, and so on, that have explored the complexity of this very human phenomenon that we call plague and pandemic. And in that sense, I mean, I walk away saying that, in the long run, as a historian, looking at things over a very long period, the longue durée, ultimately what history tells us is that we will continue to face these problems, and we will continue to stand up and to the challenge as well, and explore them and address them as best we can, whether from a political or an individual level.
Thank you for your optimism. Dr. Shabana?
Yes, so I would share actually a lot with what my colleagues said, Dr. Sumbul and Dr. Pirbhai. Obviously, epidemics have influenced human history in so many different ways. Demographics, economics, culture, even religious thought and ethics, you name it, in every aspect. But I would say as much as, and here I would be also sharing to a great extent the sentiment of Dr. Pirbhai, as much as they have inflicted quite painful, devastating, and sometimes crippling effects or harms, they have also offered important lessons for us humans to learn, lessons in humility, in resilience, and also in our capacity to cope and adapt. But on the broader issue of the value of studying the historical record on events such as the plague or pandemics, I think they are also useful in offering a very interesting perspective on understanding historical change. So for example, while some scholars, historians, philosophers emphasize certain factors in influencing historical change, such as the role of great individuals or social and economic reasons, some scholars, such as the late Marshall Hodgson, has pointed out the importance of what he calls seminal cultural traits. And ultimately, it is these seminal traits that inform and inspire how certain people react to or respond to major challenges such as epidemics and plagues. So if we would like to know for example, a little bit about Islamic history or Islamic civilization, perhaps plagues and pandemics offer also an opportunity to understand that history and that civilization a great deal.
Thank you. Dr. Kola?
I mean, I agree with much of what all my colleagues just said. I mean, with respect to Amir's comment about environmental degradation, she's 100% right. I saw a really fun tweet which said, climate change really needs COVID's publicist. And so if we want to make sure that the world we live in is around for future generations of plagues, we really got to get our act together. But I think in echoing what Ayman and Reza said, I really think the lesson that comes from history from this isn't how to cope with the current crisis. It's to know that humans have coped with this crisis. And it's almost humbling to look across different cultures and different times and see how similar a lot of these reactions have been. And therefore, just how similar humans are across time and place.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank the panelists for this very rich conversation. I also would like to thank everyone for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed hearing from some of our scholars as they applied their knowledge to this tremendous global challenge. It is clear from some of the lessons learned here today that a meaningful coronavirus response requires reflection on some of the greatest ethical questions of our time and learning from past events to construct a historical record in the present, a record that documents our actions and the deployment of our collective knowledge. Thank you, and please stay safe.